Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want? For the next 24 minutes, we're going to design and attain your ideal life. On the Way to Wow Show. Together, we'll find the ideal path to get you back on the track to success and happiness. On the Way to Wow Show with your host, Kevin Bemmel.
This week on the Way to Wow, we're going to talk to a friend of mine from my Navy days, Father Christopher Allen. Chris has taken a journey from a family that wasn't particularly religious to becoming a priest in the Orthodox Christian Church. And along the way, I think he's come up with some thoughts and insights that can help us grow more deeply spiritual. So today, I'm very pleased to have a long-standing friend of mine as a guest on the Way to Wow Show. Father Christopher Allen is an Orthodox Christian priest, although he didn't start out that way. He was actually an Anglican priest and then converted to Orthodox Christianity a little bit later in life. I met Chris when he relieved me as chaplain in Okinawa, Japan. And Okinawa went from having only one rabbi to only one Orthodox Christian priest. And they were lucky to have either one. Let me tell you, there aren't too many of us, either one of us, in the military these days. So Chris is now the rector, and I'm going to read this, at St. Joaquin and Anna Orthodox Church. Is that right? In San Antonio, Texas. And in addition to that, he also is an instructor at the Defense Language Institute on Lackland Air Force Base. Chris and his wife, Matushka Nona, have two sons. And one of your sons is in the military now, is that right?
No, actually, he decided not to go in the military. He's going a civilian route instead. Oh,
okay. So, but you know, much farther along in their lives than they were when we met all those many years ago.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you know, one of the things I find interesting is how someone finds a path to the priesthood. It's not a particularly common vocation these days. What is your story in that regard?
It went through many sort of twists and turns, as I was raised in a household with no particular religion. But when we moved from one part of town to another in the part of Connecticut I lived in, I found myself as a neighbor to a young fellow who was about my age, and he asked me to come to church with him. And it was the local congregational church, what we find in most street corners in Connecticut. And it sparked something in me. I had always had a spiritual longing, but I didn't know quite what it was. And this kind of sparked something in me. And little by little, I had a sense that I had a calling to some kind of public ministry. I didn't know how to formulate it at that point. But as time went on, I explored many different spiritual directions, but ultimately came back to, I guess, what I had been first introduced to, which was the Christian faith, and became more and more drawn to the liturgical aspect of that, ultimately moving into the Episcopal Church. And my wife and I both sort of growing together in faith. We both came from two sort of different paths in the Christian fold. And we got to a point where at one point I was sort of trying to decide what to do with my professional life. And I told her I think I was called to the ministry. And she had a very interesting reaction. She said, "Well, I wouldn't go to any church where you were the minister." And fortunately, she has since changed her tune. And indeed has in the Orthodox Church has a title of her own. A priest's wife in the Russian tradition is called Matushka. So she's Matushka Nona, which means mama, and priests are Batushka, which is papa, basically. So, as we sort of moved in through the liturgical tradition of Christianity, we became more and more convinced that the heart of Christian life was in the Orthodox Church, and so to sort of synopsize it, that's how we ended up where we are. So I've been since serving as an Orthodox priest since 2006.
So it's interesting what you said about your wife and you somehow being on a similar spiritual path and yet different. How common do you find that among people who have felt that spiritual spark and are trying to nourish it?
I think, in my experience, it seems to be quite common. As chaplains, we do a lot of couples counseling, and one of the things that I discovered with many of the couples that I worked with was that they might have, I guess as I put it before, sort of a spiritual longing, a desire for God, but they have either by dint of their background or just their separate experiences have come to it in a different way and are still trying to sort of formulate what it means to have a spiritual life together as a couple, to find unity in that. And for some, it works more easily than others. Some people find they're on a closer trajectory, and others are sort of more divergent. But I think as long as they both acknowledge that they're seeking after God and life in God, then that will help sort of continue to pull them together and forge a kind of bond, a kind of unified spiritual life in the couple. But I think it is quite common to have divergent experiences in the past.
So that leads, I think, into the next logical question, which is, what about when children are involved? Maybe not necessarily small children who perhaps would go along with the flow, whatever mommy and daddy are doing. How does that impact people who are on that spiritual journey?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think kind of a case in point might be a family I now know quite well because it's the family of my daughter-in-law, and they actually went through a process like that where they had come from an evangelical Protestant tradition. This family had 10 children, so there are many children involved, and several natural to the couple and several adopted. But they had been coming out of an evangelical tradition and for various reasons were drawn into Orthodoxy. And their children had just become very comfortable in the Baptist church where they were. But the parents made the decision and were very gentle but firmly directive in this, saying this is the path that we need to take is this, to enter the Orthodox Church. And the children, although in some ways distressed by this because they made friendships in the other church, were obedient and I think respectful of their parents' decision. Not always happy, but willing to acknowledge their parents' authority and to follow them, and ultimately. I think by virtue of the fact that the parents were gentle and understanding and willing to listen to their children and acknowledge their concerns, at the same time be firm in following the path, it gave the children confidence to follow them and trust that things could work out in a positive way. And indeed it did, ultimately. All the children having followed them into the church and now very content with it. So that's a good case in point. There are others where I suppose it might be more distressing and less successful.
So we've been talking about following this journey in the context of a group. What about for a single person who, perhaps they come from a family with no religious background or no background of involvement with God? It would seem to me to potentially be a very lonely journey. To be perhaps even a scary journey where you're risking, losing the love and respect of people you've known all or a good portion of your life. What are your thoughts about this same process for someone who's single?
You're right. It can be sometimes a scary, almost a a threatening and uncertain kind of path to take when one is branching out separately from what their family has done, and is not certain about the reactions of family and loved ones. But I think, and I would advise people who are treading that path to remain true to the calling they're feeling in their hearts, that the relationship that we forge with God is the one which ultimately will have the most profound and lasting impact on our lives, both here and in eternity. And most faith traditions will say something to the effect that by following me, by making the choice to follow the truth of the spiritual journey in which you're called, that this ultimately will be a blessing beyond any blessings you can count in this life. Now, it's still a difficult thing because you don't want to divide yourself from the people you care about, but at the same time, if you are true to yourself and true to the spiritual calling that you're experiencing, then the people who are most important to you will ultimately still, I hope, respect you for the fact that you've remained true to that.
So what would or do you say to someone who just flat out denies the existence of a spiritual component to human beings?
I find that very difficult because it's, quite honestly, it's beyond my conception. I can't conceive of a world or a life without that element, without that component. Indeed, as central to life. Even in my own experience before, as I said, I was raised in a household with no particular religion, and yet there was no sense ever. I never believed at any time that there was an absence of God. There was no spiritual element of life, even if I couldn't express it or articulate it. So when people express that to me, I can only say and talk about it in practical terms. I listen with patience, and I suppose I ask them, what is it that sustains you? What is it that is the center of your life? What is it that what strengthens you? And it seems to me that if you probe deeply enough into those questions, then I think for most people it becomes very difficult not to begin to discover a spiritual component of life. Or those people who say there is no spiritual element of their lives may simply not have recognized it and don't know how to identify it. So I suppose that would be my response.
So then peel that for us a little bit. For someone who is not in touch with the spiritual aspect of their lives or of their life, what do you see as being the benefits to discovering that aspect of themselves?
Well, I think first and foremost, it is, as far as I believe, that what is truly most central, most integral to our very being. So to not acknowledge it or to not be able to recognize it to some degree within oneself is to leave oneself empty and disconnected. I think that the spiritual component of our lives is what connects us to those around us, to the world, to creation, to the Creator, and to live without that, to live without an awareness of that, is to live in a very empty place, a very dark place, I think. It doesn't mean that there are people who don't have a spiritual sense who can in some ways live contentedly, but I think it's much more difficult. I think it's a very potentially very shallow thing. So in speaking to people who experience that or who have not experienced a spiritual element of their lives, again, I would ask those questions I mentioned before, and suggest to them exactly what I said, that there is a much deeper richness to the experience of life, and a potential for greater understanding of one's place in the cosmos when one is open to the spiritual dimension of life and is open to the movement of the Creator in one's life.
Have you seen, coming through what we've been dealing with the last, 9, 12 months, whatever it's been. Have you seen a change in the way people approach their spiritual lives? And if so, would you characterize that change?
Yeah, I have in some ways. I think, obviously, as an active parish priest, the first thing that I see is the response of my own parishioners. And it's been a struggle between faith and fear, I think, where there's a fear in to some degree reasonable, to some degree perhaps somewhat unreasonable, of the risks involved with the disease, and obviously I'm not trying to discount the risks involved with the disease, especially for those who are vulnerable. But there is a need to trust God in the face of risk and danger and dismay. And so there's been a real struggle in people, real sort of tearing their hearts between, I'm worried, will my action cause harm or risk to someone else? Will I be in danger? And at the same time, a desire to be part of the worshiping community. And so it's kept people away, it's made people tentative. In a couple of cases I'm aware of, it's even caused people simply to leave entirely. Because they don't know what else to do. They're convinced that the risks are too great to even participate in even a moderate way. So, and I think that's sort of reflected in the larger society, and it seems like there's a polarization happening too. There are those who are adamant that nothing will stand in the way of entering into worship and being part of their faith communities, and they're absolutely convinced of this, and so they it's almost a rebellious attitude in some cases, and others who are absolutely terrified. And I think there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground. It seems like you sort of swing one direction and swing the other direction. And again, I see that sort of the microcosm where I am, where there's not a lot of either pole, and there's some in the middle. Or I'm sorry, to put it the other way, there's kind of a lot of either pole. Either people who are absolutely dedicated, that kind of no matter what. Some who are just, no matter how many precautions they take, they won't come out. They'll watch online, right? They won't come in. So
I'm going to ask you to sum up here. If you could give someone one piece of advice for engaging more deeply in their spiritual life, and give us 30 seconds from Father Christopher Allen, how can someone do that?
Okay. I would say what I say to even my parishioners: if you have to, take 30 seconds when you get up and be still. If you don't have a prayer to say, if you're not part of a faith community, if you don't have a religious mission, take 30 seconds and be still. We are nothing but busy and in motion constantly in our life. And the only way to begin to encounter God, to encounter our relationship with the Creator and the cosmos and its creation, is to stop for just a few moments. So even if you start with 30 seconds, if you're so busy, all you can do is give 30 seconds. Stop and be still for 30 seconds. And just that seed can plant the desire for more of that stillness, and even to begin to utter prayers, to find someone with whom to have fellowship and share that spiritual life and desire. So if you can't do anything else, stop. Take that 30 seconds and be still.
Wonderful. Well, we have your thing to put on our collage. Oh, that's right. It's right here. And this is your grandmother, I believe, right?
Great grandmother.
Oh, great grandmother. Tell us just real quickly a bit of the story.
Yeah, she had a tragic life and died young. She was sent to a mental institution for reasons that are sort of obscure. The family kind of hid that and made a different story about it. And I tell that not because I want to it's because she was someone whose life was essentially sort of cut off from her. She cut off from her family. She lost her husband in a train wreck in 1915. She couldn't see her sons. And she died sort of having been sent out to live with the cousins after she'd been released from a mental institution. And yet she was a gentle soul, and she was, in a sense, taken away from her own family of birth and put in another family where she didn't fare well. And I think for her because there's no reason that anyone's life has to be that lonely or tragic. And I want to emphasize that when I think of her, I think of her loss, and I think of her loneliness, and I don't want people to have to experience that.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to put her up here on our collage. I think we're going to put her among some good friends. Chris, it was great seeing you. Thank you so much for being on the Way to Wow show. Blessings, blessings, blessings to you and your family.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you and seeing you again.
I want to thank my guests for this week's Way to Wow show, Father Christopher Allen. I think we should heed his advice to stop and be still for just 30 seconds a day to give our spirits a chance to connect to something beyond ourselves. Next week is a very special episode, especially for me, because we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking to my daughter about a subject that's troubled me for many, many years, and that is how much she likes and how much time she spends playing video games online. Maybe she can tell us something that I haven't thought of. Who knows? Courage at all times, my friends. Marie, you're still my belle.